Bonjour, I just want to start by acknowledging that we are on my homelands, actually, of the Three Fires people, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi folks. Hi, Danny. Nice to see you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to share work with you today. One of my new disclaimers is you need to know that I am speaking for myself as a professor at Northwestern and not as the Spencer's SVP today. And I'm really excited to share the work with you, although I decided that I was going to give a slightly different talk than the abstract I sent, so I hope you like it anyway. So I guess I'll start by giving a little bit of context. Some of you will know this spiel from me, but I'm happy to report that this is still a core proposition of my work, and I feel like I think a lot about the constructions of what I would call nature-culture relations. And I think about this link construct as grounding human activity in a series of ways that I have been after making sense of as a program of research for a long time. Everything from understanding how it shapes human activity and impacts things like social organization, relations, and decision making, that it figures centrally in knowledge domains, both domains, disciplines, and communities, and there's variations of these constructs, some of which are visible to us, some of which are implicit. It's shaped by power and historicity. Nature culture shape and impact cognition and development, and that learning environments reflect and facilitate specific nature-culture relations, whether they intend to or not. Okay? And for me, part of what I've been after and what I think is a grand challenge of the 21st century is developing teaching and learning that cultivates just, sustainable, and culturally thriving communities. And I think that part of what we have to be after is heterogeneous perspectives and understanding how normative nature-culture relations have been shaping and continue to shape the unfoldings of the world. And then what we're really after is redesigning nature-culture relations into a kind of human maturation that are both ethical and healthful, both for the more than human world as well as the human world. And part of the way that I do that is think about then what needs to transform about learning environments and how they often reify dimensions of human supremacy as a foundational construct, dispossession, extraction, and erasure. And part of what you may or may not have just noticed is I put a series of images that are over the last few years of serious kinds of things that are happening in the world. I am stopping with this one because what has been happening in Bolivia makes me fluctuate between sorrow and rage. And it's probably a really important thing to realize that Evo Morales is responsible for actually pushing forward the rights of nature and a new kind of global paradigm for what we might need as humans. And he was just ousted. He is also the only indigenous president of a contemporary nation state in the world. And so for me, I'm thinking a lot about how these dynamics actually are playing out on global scales all the way to classroom scales. So I start there to say that for me, the things that I'm going to talk to you about today say something to this. Whether I'm skillful at narrating back and forth, we'll see. So what does that mean? So I start with this premise, and I think that as a field, we need to continue to work on the idea that all teaching and learning is political and ethical, and that the design of learning environments actually decides about politics and ethics. And so I start as a design researcher thinking about that the design of a learning environment is a series of decisions, things like what should students learn, why should they learn it, how should they learn it, where should they learn it, who should teach it, and how should teachers teach it. Those are all politically and ethically infused decisions that shape what ways of knowing and being are available to learners and how they're powered. And for me, I am cautiously optimistic that something new could emerge with NGSS today. But I'm really interested and think it's necessary to think about how it is that education actually can cultivate and change our collective socio-ecological futures. That is, I really want education to be a source of good for human communities, and I come from indigenous communities where education has been one of the more serious weapons of colonialism to inflict harm on our communities. So I'm really after transformation. Today what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you that I think that there are, that I think as a field we need a better grammar of design. to explain what it is we're doing, and a bit more careful ways of thinking about how are we engaging in design work. And part of what you should hear is I think lots of people are engaged in design work with good intentions. But I think we don't yet have a careful enough way to understand the impacts of our design in ways that we're being deliberate about saying, here's what I'm reifying, here's what I'm trying to disrupt, and here's how I understand what happens when I do those things. Okay, so I'm going to end up talking to you a little bit about kind of 3 dimensions that I think are important, and I'm going to have to hurry up or I'm never going to get through this talk. But I'm really after refusing normative power in history, engaging heterogeneity generatively, and what I mean by that, I think we can have learning environments where kids are learning multiple ways of knowing. Usually what I say, it's not that I don't want my children learning Western science, but I don't want them only learning Western science or only feeling dominated by it. How do we do multiplicities is really what I'm after. And then how do we do it in consequential ways? We have taken decision-making and deliberation around possible futures largely out of children's everyday lives. And that broad scale, growing up to someday have enough agency to do something in the world is probably a bad paradigm for young people. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where we're at in thinking about the design of learning environments, and I want to acknowledge that some of this work is actually kind of insights that I've developed with deep partners over long periods of time. But I'm going to end up focusing on a case study today that is a specific study with the Seattle Native community. But it's important to me to acknowledge that the things that I'm sharing, I did not come up with my own. These are things that Native communities that I've been learning with community members for a really long time. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a grammar of design and then do a case study, some case study work where we'll get into looking at kids. So for me, I've been really after trying to figure out what is so different when I design with communities. Why does the design with communities feel so different than when I'm sitting with a group of teachers in a school? And part of what I'm going to go through is a few things about the ways that I've come to understand the kinds of grounds that we end up talking about that are often quite different. Not that we can't get teachers there, by the way. I don't hear that as like we can't get teachers there. I just think that there are some ways that once we go through formal schooling, the kinds of ways that we talk about things become restricted or settled in particular kinds of ways. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The first is to say that I think that we are not very transparent about our design politics. That is, what is the political that is driving the way that we are creating learning environments? And part of what I think that is that when we say things like I'm after increased student outcomes or achievement, I think sometimes people say that and they don't necessarily get what that implies as well. And most of that is based in an economic rhetoric about why that's important for well-being that I have serious questions about. It's not that I don't want people to achieve. I'm just saying driving as design may not be like good human design. So for us, we've really been after refusing normative power in history and thinking about kind of 2 parts around decolonizing and indigenizing education. And I want to be clear, I think about decolonial and anti-racist education as part of it, but not sufficient. I don't think most 5-year-olds need to be decolonized. And so for me and our work over time is to say that most of the time what I see as adults want to do critical education towards the decolonial and towards the anti-racist, and we haven't done enough to imagine. And so for me, I think a lot about that we're so practiced at seeding our children to these systems, we can't imagine beyond the critical, and that's part of the ethical for me. So for me, that decolonial and resurgence piece is actually necessary. We have to do the work of decoloniality and anti-racism as adults who have survived systems, but I don't want to make that the only grounds from which we can raise children, okay? So I think about my design ethic in this way, is that I'm really after cultivating everyday indigenous resurgence and what Leanne Simpson has called the struggle for decolonial territory. And Vine Deloria is a kind of hero of mine, but has talked about that in indigenous education, that it has to come from within our intellectual traditions, and that comes through the land, and I would add water, and using indigenous contexts and indigenous processes. He says we should be concerned with recreating the conditions within which this learning occurred, not merely the content of the practice itself. Well, I think that multicultural education or culturally responsive education has gotten us in some places. I do think there are kinds of artifacts of a kind of anthropological teaching about cultural diversity not taking up the practices, the epistemic practices of that. So we've been after that. Even in, just to say, I think the field does that, and I think in the beginning of a lot of the design work I was doing, we were doing that ourselves within community and had to figure out what does that look like, right? I'll keep going. So what does that mean, and how have we come to think about that? Part of what I'm getting at is, for a while in communities 20 years ago, there was a kind of way that community might talk about our culture without our intellectual traditions, as if academics wasn't also cultural, as if indigenous people didn't have science or mathematics or histories, right? We had cultural practices. And part of what I'm after here is that part of what this is about is recognizing that we've done this thing in the field to sequester culture as not central always to human thought, okay? And so I've been after trying to understand, what does it mean, the conditions? What does it mean to create the conditions under which indigenous knowledge systems are regenerating, not something boxed and passed? So for us, we've been after, and I've been finding ways to talk about this as one of the central pieces around epistemic actions. And I think about this, I borrow a lot of this from Goodwin and others, but epistemic actions are the everyday ways that people, human beings, engage in meaning making. We all do it in different ways perhaps, but it's just the everyday ways that we make sense. We do this weird thing where someone stands up here and lectures and you listen as a kind of epistemic action in the academy. It's not actually how it works every day, but this is the kind of everyday kind of things. And part of what Goodwin and others have talked about is that there are semiotic landscapes that we set the conditions under which new epistemic actions can happen. Right? In micro-interactional places, we build with each other. There isn't a flat ground that doesn't have a previous kind of, doesn't already have inflections. There's lots of ways to talk about it. We talk about Bakhtin if we wanted to, but this is to understand that I'm talking about a landscape as the grounds for knowing. There is good work around in-place semiotics. I'm really after understanding why it is we think that learning in boxes like this, sequestered from the natural world, has become normed. This isn't always how human activity and learning looked. And I also think a lot about how that the coordination of attention, that is the ways in which epistemic actions unfold, is a kind of curatorial process. It is intergenerational. Sometimes we might talk about it as expert-novice, but it happens in micro-interactional kind of curatorial ways. You all are being curated to both listen to me, but also look at my slides. I will produce a series of things to help information flow. I'm curating your attention right now. We do this for kids all the time, or whatever tools we use, whatever practices we use, we're directing attention all the time. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a sense, just because some of you might be like, I have no idea what she's talking about. So we have been after a series of epistemic actions. I'm going to give you a quick example of this and show you a little bit of data for all of the folks in here that want data and not theory. There are kind of 4 key epistemic actions. There's probably about 12 others too, but these I'm really, really sure of. We've studied these in different, across age, over time, that we've been looking at for a long time. And I'm just going to show you what these look like at the epistemic action level. We've been after understanding, is forming a relation a kind of epistemic action? Is placing, that is, do people care or use place as a relevant semiotic landscape or resource in meaning making? Something we call perspective taking, and I'll say more about this. And then this other one is one that there's good cross-cultural research to demonstrate that actually there is some really interesting variation around spatial and temporal shifting in cognitive processes. That has some cultural predictors about it. So we were really interested in this. And I'm going to show you an example, just to make sure you both get epistemic actions, but also some results about this. So we did these studies with 3- and 4-year-olds, with both children on their own and with an adult. We did it across 3 cultural communities. I'm going to show you an example. I can say more if you'd want. I'm going to play this, and then I'm going to explain it. So there are many things to say about this, but I'm only after showing you a couple of epistemic actions and the kinds of landscapes. So in this context, I would argue that the parent starts, these are examples, there's others in here, but the parent asks, it directs attention, let's see his talons, the kid shows it, right? So there's a context shaping, context renewing that's at a particular scale. They go on to, the parent asks, is the Magisi hungry? That's a request for a particular form of epistemic engagement from the perspective of the Magisi, that's an eagle, and it's attending to the internal state. The child actually renews that context and answers, given the kind of epistemic action that was just requested from the adult. He's trying to find some fish. She answers from the perspective of the fish. And the parent does this context confirming thing, some fish. All right, so part of what I'm just hoping you'll see, you shouldn't make too much of what's going on here, although there's the particular epistemic actions. I'm trying to make sure you see that the epistemic landscapes and epistemic actions happen at this fine a grain size in human activity always, okay? I guess I could say some more, but I think I'm gonna skip that and keep going. So here's one thing just to say, we've done this enough to say that placing, and in that microinteractional looking for this, so it happens. When you provide place as a semiotic landscape, children and adults use it. They use it as central to sense making. There's important cultural variation, obviously, but I just want to point out that it is both true when kids do it, or that kids and adults will use it when made available. When we only provide an abstract and a deep place content, we are already doing something that is different than what we might call as natural, or what cognitive processes would happen, okay? We also learned that shifting spatial relations is also something that kids do. In this particular part of the study, we wanted to understand what was the conceptual domain that seemed to drive spatial scales. And you should probably ignore most of what the habitat, eating, drinking behavior is, but what I wanted you to see here is that we can see that shifting spatial scales is a routine cognitive activity as well in epistemic actions, both across cultures with also important cultural variation. And then the last thing I'll just say is we saw perspective taking, and I emphasized that one when the parent asked kids to reason from the perspective of the eagle. Developmental psychology used to claim that children, 3-year-olds, weren't capable of taking the perspective of another. They had claimed that biologically and developmentally it wasn't yet possible for a long time. Part of what I want to point out is here's a 3-year-old that not only is reasoning from the perspective of another, it's a more than human other, and holding the frame. Okay, and we can see that multiple times. We do see a big cross-cultural difference that has played out over time here. We can also see it in adult reasoning too, okay? I'm gonna keep going, but I wanna be clear when I talk about epistemic actions, learning environments resource and ask kids to perform particular epistemic actions always. That may seem like a non-starter to you. The point is though, those epistemic actions are deeply aligned with particular knowledge systems, even at the way that we ask a question. Okay, the form of a question has those things embedded in them. I said this already, this was the second layer for us in designing is thinking about the ways that epistemic actions are intertwined with ontological claims. And so what I'll say about that, ontological claims, at least the fast way to explain them, are kind of foundational assertions about the nature and categories of being and their relations, what things exist or can exist, and they vary across knowledge systems and are shaped by power and historicity. And classrooms, again, make ontological assertions all the time. We've done studies with Native children where we asked them what they thought their science teachers thought was alive and what they thought their elders were alive, and they knew that what their science teachers thought was ontologically real in the world and what their elders or adults thought were ontologically in the real world, in the real, you know what I mean? We're not the same. That is, kids may not use the word ontology, but they know that different learning environments assert what's real in the world. So children are navigating ontological realities all the time, and part of what we've been interested in is understanding if ontological denial, that is, even the mere presence of Native people, is always up for debate, or the legitimacy of our knowledge systems as routine experience in schooling, what happens? What is that as a developmental challenge to have to routinely navigate ontological denial? Okay, and for us, we've been after this for a while. That's indigenous specific. This part is true for children everywhere, right? So human beings deal with ontological assertions. That's not a culturally specific. The variation in what those are. And part of what I'll say is that even in science, ontological possibilities are always shifting. Right? 30 years ago, the ideas that plant had communicative capacity was quack science. If we look at the last 10 years of botany and what's happening in ecological sciences, we know there's far more interspecies interactions that actually account for evolution and what is happening in dynamic ecosystems than we imagined before, right? Sciences go through ontological shifts all the time. So part of what I'm getting at here is that expertise also does this. I had a good question today from a student that said, what happens when people deny your question or interest is possible? And we talked a little bit about how this is a routine thing, okay? I also like this one because when we first started doing this work, all the elders said we need to re-engage our kids with remaking relatives with plant worlds, and I'd like the good developmentalist that I had become in graduate school. I was like, no, kids don't pay attention to plants until much older. That's so true. But that's what the research said at that time, right? That we paid attention to particular kinds of movements, and that young children did a series of things and wouldn't be interested in plants. I still remember that meeting, and I had an elder kind of tap me on the back and say, it's okay, we'll bring you back. The thing is, ontological claims also shape socio-political possibilities. So I started out here, I've given this slide at other talks. I didn't always have to start with Evo Morales being ousted and threatened. But part of what I want to get at is the idea that the natural world or more than human world has rights beyond extraction or beyond management is a new legal paradigm globally, right? We didn't fathom that there should be legal rights for more than humans until some people have been working on this for about 30 years, but it got some traction in the last 10 years, okay? I'd really like to do a shout out to Ohio, who passed that Lake Erie has legal rights according to Ohio. Really surprising to me. But this is happening, right? It's happening in the world, that people fathoming new ontological possibilities is also shaping everyday legal activity. Based in this is a series of axiological positionings, and I would argue we always do this. So I draw on Jay Lemke's work for this a lot, but the point of this, Bakhtin also wrote about this, is that in discourse, there's a way that we position the other always. Whether that's content, disciplinary content, or other humans, or more than humans, but there is always a kind of valued positioning happening. And Lemke has talked about that those are typically driven by ideological claims, I might argue ontological imaginings too, that really pushes, and what we do in learning environments is decide. We decide about the axiological positionings. The deep critique to get rid of deficit models is the field trying to get rid of the axiological positioning that students of color and poor students are somehow less prepared or less capable than others, right? We are working on a axiological repositioning as a field in those kinds of ways.
Would you mind just doing 60 seconds on what axiological is?
Yeah. So my fast version, axiology is the dimension of knowledge systems about what you think is right, true, good, beautiful in the world, okay? There's lots more, and if there were any philosophers in the room, they might be completely offended and run out. But I think that's probably okay for now. The point is that we also see axiological positionings happening in the world all the time too. So I always think the Seattle Times, which was last year, so the National Energy Board says the Trans Mountain Pipeline should be approved despite impacts on indigenous cultures, and that the pipeline will be detrimental to the environment but beneficial to Canadian national interest. Right? There's a kind of axiological positioning happening in those constructions always. What's good, what's better, what counts as more, why we should make decisions. Those kinds of axiological positions happen in activity all the time. I also want to draw attention to our most recent presidential proclamation about the current month. Is an interesting one to hear him narrate about why we should be attending to the founders and the veterans who fought for this nation, but not the Native people here. So there's always axiological positioning happening. Oh, I don't know why that's there. Well, because it's another image that was supposed to be up there. We still haven't figured out water in Flint either, by the way. So part of what I want to be clear about is that for me in my work, I'm actually always thinking about these axiologies and ontological denial, at least when I'm talking with Native people and thinking about Native contexts. And And I want to show systematically 87% of standards dictate teaching about Indigenous people as pre-1900. Axiologically, the general public is positioned to think about it as dead and past, making things like calling off, he didn't technically call it off, he just didn't proclaim it, as a non-issue. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I'm just curious if everyone knows what I'm talking about. Trump did not sign a declaration for Native History Month, right? Didn't even make the news, right? If he'd done that for any other community, quite frankly, I think there probably would have been some national news about that, but he didn't even make the news. Part of the point about this is that if we think about the ways in which our representation of Indigenous peoples are allowed to show up, there are particular axiologies in place. And I also want to say there's a deep no recognition of the Native diaspora. 78% of Native children live in urban communities. The general public thinks that we should always be going to reservations to understand Indigenous communities. And I just wanted to demonstrate that. I think that there's also really important work that we can think about the relationship between our representations in schools and things like increasing suicide. Elliot is a Native scholar who has actually looked at whether or not there are future tense about Indigenous futurities present in communities and schools, and there tends to be none. And from a psychological perspective, one problem that we know emerges from suicidation, if you can't project an authentic future self, it's the grounds for suicidation. Okay? So now you've gotten a series of layers here, and I'm hoping what you'll hear is that I'm suggesting that actually as part of design, we are always making decisions, perhaps reifying decisions we didn't realize were already made, along epistemic, ontological, and axiological grounds. Now I'm going to try to transition and show you an example of where we are. I'm going to go really fast because I talked too long. So this is a long-term design project called Expansive Meanings and Makings in Art Science. It's actually a project that has a sister site with colleagues in Boston that was actually in a high school. I'm only going to talk about the informal context. And really, we were after designing climate change education. We call it ICEAM. And we call it ICEAM Changing Lands and Waters. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but what I'm really hoping to get into is to actually show you some of the ways in which sense-making around heterogeneity actually happens in these learning environments, and some of the practice moves and reframings that we see instructors doing over time. So if you're curious about the study timeline, I'm going to do this really fast, starting in 2013, and then we get a series of no-cost extensions from NSF to keep doing analysis for as long as we possibly can. There's a series of other layers about it. We have a the data set is ridiculous and also exciting. We have kids who have been in this program for 5 or 6 years now that we're starting to be able to do analysis over time. But it's hundreds of hours of videotape. It's hundreds of interviews. So we're in the process. I'll tell you that this is kind of how our analytical processes happen. I'm not going to say tons about this, but we typically apply a kind of third-generation activity theory in our design work. We were deliberate. It's a full-day program from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. We were deliberate about designing multiple interacting activity systems. Usually when you design in school, you get an hour chunk if you're lucky, right? And we really wanted to understand, if we were deliberate about designing multiple things, what could we understand about what traveled for kids across the day or across the weeks, okay? We also are really interested in understanding how that plays out spatially. So we do some spatial mappings. I'll show you in a minute. And really, at this point, what we've really done is looked at microethnographies and interaction. We will be closer to being able to say something quantitatively across the data set about epistemic actions in like 6 months, hopefully. I'm not going to say much else about that. This project, though, if you hadn't caught it already, we're really interested in creating what we call land and water-based science education. And part of what I'll say about this, people usually are like, but wait, bench sciences. I totally think we still need to do bench science, and I think that we're in a place where the data sets that we typically engage young people in are outdated, and that the world needs more field scientists. I also think bench scientists tend to engage in field-based science in some ways too, but largely our K-12 system has been teaching kids in bench science-driven ways, and I have questions about that. I think we probably need much more balanced science education, where we have some field science and some bench science. We don't have any field yet. In this project, we think about really we're after designing for nature-culture relations, and the way that we talk about that is relational onto-epistemologies. Really what you should hear is, this is a way of talking about indigenous knowledge systems. It is not the case that all indigenous knowledge systems probably buy into this view. It is the case that lots of them do, and over collective co-design, people felt okay with this, okay? In this particular project, we had 3 places of ICEAM inquiries and camps. One was at a cultural center called Discovery Park, a former military site, Carkeek Park, which is the only place that has a salmon run in Seattle proper, and it happens because of the Suquamish tribe, and I'll say more about that. And then this place called Mima Mounds, which is like this super interesting place where Western scientists don't have a agreed upon explanation about how these mounds came to be. And my favorite theory is very large prairie dogs once upon a time that have since gone extinct. Other people call it about water melting, but it's really interesting. Like, you go there and there are like all these different, and then there's the Coast Salish story, which people have a very definite story about how this came to be. This project is a participatory design project, and people sometimes ask what that means. We had elders, parents or guardians, youth, young adults, some content experts, both agreed and not agreed, and then what I like to say is emergent researchers who took up roles both as designers and researchers, but also took up roles as facilitators and teachers. And I just want to be clear about that. We did it once and it was not very good when we started by hiring someone as the teacher. What we learned about that is that porous roles in innovative design are really necessary, or people get entrenched in the identity that they've been handed in the middle of creative processes. So here's what I hope we'll get to. I'm doing all right. So I want to give you enough of a sense of our specs of what this design looked like and how it connects. So like any good educator, a big question, an important reason for engaging in an inquiry, we came up with these questions that kind of drove our camp, that we reiterated and actually used all the time in camp. So the first one is how are our homelands and waters in the Puget Sound being impacted by climate change and ocean acidification? That was what camp was intended to do. And then what should we do? What are our responsibilities? And the should we question, I would like to argue, I think we should have in science instruction all the time. I think that we are in phases of needing to deliberate with incomplete data sets that have ethical consequences, and we don't often engage kids in should we. We ask them to debate now. And debate often becomes about who's right and who's wrong in a way that doesn't include ethical deliberation. So we didn't know that should we question when we first wrote it, like 7 or 8 years ago, would produce this kind of other interaction. So just to say that we did this because it was not as well thought through now as it was 7 or 8 years ago. And what are our responsibilities was really about trying to center the way that indigenous knowledge systems often think about and position people to think about their roles, their relations, their responsibilities, and what we've come to call our gifts. In that one of the things that an elder has said to us is the problem with Western education is it makes everyone think they should know the same thing, and then we don't meet each other anymore. And that actually if the gifts piece here is that if different people have different roles, different forms of expertise, collectively you do something more interesting. And so I always love that story in relationship to kind of what we understand about heterogeneous problem-solving groups, right? Even if we think about that at the expert level. There are 4 kinds of things that I want to say about how we ended up designing. So we start with indigenous groundings, always. I'm going to say more about what these are. We end up in these processes of what we call remaking relations. We engage in inquiries into cutting-edge phenomena, and then we do this thing that we're currently calling world makings. I'm going to say a little bit about what these are. In indigenous grounding and framings, there are kind of 4 things, is that we always start from land or water, our songs, our stories, and that our learning environments are intergenerational. We're kind of beginning paradigms that we wanted to normalize, which for indigenous scholarship, our stories are our frameworks. They're our theories. They're not our fables. There are theories for how to be in the world and how the world works, and we start there. Remaking relations is really about actually making sure that young people are reemerging and engaging in land and place as in relations. School has taught kids to engage outdoors as either play-based, which play is really good, I'm not saying it's not, but it's different than engaging in learning with the natural world. And so there's work to actually help students re-engage in that, teachers as well too, by the way, and to be in kind of right relations with a more than human world, as well as each other. So one of the things that we've learned over time is that kids play out and have questions about all the complicated social relations that they're experiencing elsewhere, that we have to help them navigate explicitly. When we first started doing that, we didn't like to talk about Western constructions of lots of things. Gender and sexuality is an example that has emerged very strongly for our kids, where they want to be able to talk about it with us and understand the differences between indigenous constructions of gender and sexuality and Western constructions as kids are navigating things. It's just an example, but the each other has become more and more salient as kids have been more and more deeply invested in the co-design. Inquiries into cutting-edge phenomena. We've done things like we study ocean acidification, we've thought about ecological collapse and restoration. We actually witnessed, as part of camp, the starfish wasting disease die-off on the Pacific coast, where 85% of starfish died in 2 summers. They're a keystone species in tidal pools, so it's a big deal. And we'll see, recovery is happening, sorta. But we also spent a lot of time thinking about waterways and salmon regeneration. Without tribal hatcheries, the salmon runs would collapse in the Pacific Northwest, which would lead to ecological collapse in the Pacific Northwest. Right now, there's only about a 2% return, but without them, you would have actually devastating ecological collapse within 20 years. And it's not the state who's preventing that. Okay, so kids get to learn about those things. The park that I mentioned, Karkik, the Suquamish tribe does that. It's not a sustainable run. There's too much water runoff from the city, so every time the salmon come back and hatch, it'll rain, and then all of the roe will get flushed down the river. So why it's sustained is there's a green imprint pond, sustainable imprint pond that's all solar powered, that Suquamish provides the fish roe. Many schools come and learn about restoration efforts using this. So it's actually a public relations educational initiative there, but it's really interesting. I don't know if you all have ever seen salmon up close. They're massive, and this is a very small stream, and it usually is the space where people are like, I can't fathom. The other thing you should know about salmon, mostly because it's just cool, at one point there was enough salmon going upstream that it would revitalize the soil, nutrient content. So it was one of the main redistributors of soil health in the Pacific Northwest. But because the runs have been minimized, we see massive soil degradation higher up in the mountains. Okay? So salmon are really interesting, and kids get to learn about all these things. And then the last thing I'll just say is we do world makings. So there are all kinds of ways, tribal initiatives like salmon restoration. We think a lot about deliberations and potentials. And then we've been engaged in things like harvesting. We're doing a lot of indigenous LARPing, which I'm not going to say much about, but if anyone's interested. And then various forms of art making, from theater to weaving to digital storytelling. But part of what's emerged is that we end up in these studio times where kids are actually thinking about the narrative structures and the futures that they're making as part of the science. And part of what I'll say is when a kid wants to make a digital story about the chemical equation for ocean acidification at 7 and also tell you what you should do, for us those are examples of like something's going right. Okay, I'm going to skip to actually tell you, show you some data. So part of what I want to do here is actually make visible like what do I mean by epistemic actions and ontological heterogeneity in kid thinking. I'm going to show you a little bit about why and how we've gotten to, we are not actually making enough space for kids to think about axiological possibilities. And then I'm going to show you some ways that this has shifted over time. So I'm going to tell you a story called Una Cedar, Salmon and Hummingbird. And for those of you who recognize this little girl, it's because she has parents who released her thing to be shown publicly. So here's a girl, she's 8 or 9 in this picture. Her dad is a professional scientist, and she, in a preview said, when we asked her about science, she said, it's something that white people do. We do it at school. It's not something that really helps us. I think it hurts us. Part of what I want to get at is that we've done the work, most Native kids think this, and it's historically true. Scientists actually have been witnesses in most anti-sovereignty law and cases in the United States for the past 60 years. Okay? So there's part of the reason I want to say that is we could easily say, oh, this is really sad, and there's historical truths to it. And the question is what happens for her when science looks like the science on the right and not only the stereotype on the left, okay? By the way, I'll also tell you, Una has since been a scientist with a white lab coat for Halloween. So also there's some shifting there. So I'm going to show you this first vignette, which I'm hoping will help us see kind of the onto-epistemic navigations that I'm talking about that we think is really exciting. And it's based on activities where we're trying to understand forest ecosystems. Part of what you may be noticing is that fires are actually about climate change, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. We have more and more forest fires that have to do with changing rainfall. That is actually a long-term impact of climate change. They were learning about this. Cedar in particular was an example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit about the place of story in this and then what it looks like in activity. So this particular activity started with a story about Grandmother Cedar, and it's a Samish story. Part of what you need to know about this is that Grandmother Cedar is really lonely. She prays to Creator to bring, to help her with her loneliness. Creator brings her a seed. It's her grandson. She helps raise it up. She does things like protect the grandson cedar, the seedling, from heavy rains, heavy wind, too much sun. And there's a whole series of things in the story where there's protection happening from Grandmother Cedar. And over time, grandson cedar grows tall and protects Grandma Cedar. Okay? There's lots more to that story, but for time purposes, it's the basic narrative that you need to know. One of them is, though, also that Grandma Cedar protects the seedling, the sapling from things like deer or bears or raccoons or other animals that actually do things like girth them, like knock them over while they're scratching, all kinds of things. Okay, it's embedded in the story. And so I'm going to show you an activity we call the Plant Relative Walk, where kids were grouped into multi-age groups. They became experts at a particular plant relative, and then their job was actually to teach each other. And there was a series of tools that were utilized. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but I want to reflect that the tools and mediations that we engage in learning environments have political and ethical positionings in them. It took us a while to recognize that we were producing tools that didn't have any indigenous language. We had kind of digested like, oh, but there's 60 kids in here and 25 different languages. We just can't ethically do anything about that. And this changed over time where we used the language of the peoples whose lands we were on, and it signaled a particular kind of thing. There's all kinds of other things around knowledge organization in here, but I just wanted to point out that our very detailed kinds of ways that we construct tools in classrooms have political and ethical consequences too. This activity was along this trail. You can see that there are 9 spots. You should ignore all the red and black and blue. That was a way for us to start creating data. But part of what we were after here is we both wanted to see what was designed and what was emergent. And I'm going to show you an interaction between groups that was at the tail end of the design, of when someone said, I have a question. We hadn't planned for this kind of activity. And here we go.
So when the leaves of the maple tree die, they fall on the ground and they compost, and that's really good soil for the rest of the plants. And over towards here, there's sproutlings. I'm not really sure what plant, but there's some that I think. Yes. You're really emotional enough on that. Are you trying to be so happy? They kind of like the grandma cedar tree, they kind of shield the other smaller one.
So why do they grow in such non-straight ways? What?
I believe that's a way that they're trying to help out other plants by moving around, having the trunks move around, so it will cover more areas.
It could also be,
Because they need more sun.
yeah, it's also, because
They need more sun.
they spread out so that they can get more sun.
And they
And
take
more
it
leaves.
and
We're trying to see what's one.
Also, since they shield it off,
When the leaf drop, it is from the
and also that the little trees don't burn out and they also don't drown in the water.
All right, so here's what I want to point out, and hopefully you can see some of this. So one of the things that is happening here is that we actually see them making kind of ecological sense around complex systems in the beginning, right? We're understanding how things like decomposition and soil health happen from big trees dropping their leaves. And then there becomes a question. We see Una actually use grandmother cedar as a metaphor and framework to think through the rest of it, right? She's actually attending to what that tree is trying to do. It's trying to shade and help other trees. And I'm going to skip that and just say, and then what we see is a teacher asks, so why do they grow in non-straight ways? We see the two older students give the photosynthesis answer, right? It is the thing that we teach them in school. And you can see Una in that moment feel like, oh yeah, I gave the wrong answer. Oh yeah, that's why, they need more sun. But actually the older kids come back and start saying, actually it is also true that they shield, that they do these other things. Now, ecologists might not use shielding language in the way that kids are right here, but understanding the relationship between tree canopy and forest health and decomposition actually is central to forestry sciences, right? And so there's a relationship here that actually is quite productive, even if all we cared about was Western science. But part of what I want to make visible here is that Una gets asked a question that she has to make something up on the spot. She's trying to figure something out. And her traditional stories become the thing that guide her thought, right? We've created the conditions under which indigenous ways of thinking are emergent at those times. So for us, actually, those are productive in both ways. And there's all kinds of ways to extend this, but I wanted to show this is the kind of thing that we've been after cultivating for a long time. So I'm going to keep going for time, because I really want to show you the end part, which means I'm going to go a little bit over too. We had campers draw a picture of camp towards the end of these. And part of what we were interested in is what was the storyline they were getting from camp. And I'm going to ignore Lear and show you Una's picture. So you might look up here, it says before, now, after, in a while, boom. And to be honest, this is pretty much the public narrative of what's happening to the planet and climate change. We were not very happy about this when we first saw it, or I was not, because I wasn't there when they presented. I actually was really disturbed. I was like, oh God, we are actually doing harm. This is not helping kids imagine potential agentic futures at all. But here's what Una says. So she says, okay, this is the year before settlers came and everything was really peaceful. This is now. Sarah, the teacher, says, okay. Una says, this is in the future. Sarah says, what's happening in the future? Una says, everything's dead, everything is dying. And Sarah says, everything's dying, and Una says, and while the world goes into destruction, then you can see a slow motion of what will happen. Sarah says, that's a pretty sad story you told. Why are you smiling? Una says, because, and Sarah says, no, tell me about it. Do you think, is that really what you think is going to happen? And Una says, yep, if nobody will change, it's probably what is going to happen. Sarah says, do you think we can change? Una says, yes. This is just story number 1. I want to make another story to see if the next one has possibilities. So this is one possible future? And you think we could have other ones, and they go on to talk about what it could take. What I'm getting at here is that we still see the dominant narrative as the powered one she wanted to draw, but also a critical consciousness that other worlds are possible. When we first started redesigning, we started thinking about what had we not been resourcing in design, and how had we not been opening up the taking seriously, right? She knew in her smile that this isn't what we wanted her to get, and yet she also was letting us know that we hadn't quite disrupted enough, right, is one way to read this. And so we really thought about this. So a year later, we had spent a lot of time engaging what we like to call pedagogical sharpening, and we thought a lot about it around like how is settler colonialism functioning. And if you think about in Una's picture, she starts out with a socio-political orientation. It was before, it was pre-contact, through contact. Right? The socio-political narrative was actually structuring her diagram of the story of the world in really interesting ways. Turns out that a lot of Native kids did this unprompted. We didn't tell them to do that, but it was a story that they got. In some ways, we saw that as a really good thing. It meant that they were actually thinking beyond colonial time and how they were imagining the histories of the world. So we wanted to get much more explicit about this. We realized that we hadn't intentionally been doing those things. It had been coming out. And one of the things we really got after is sort of thinking about this idea of reframings. And I'm going to show you some things about this and how we were mediating shifts in understanding the kind of socio-political context or the kinds of political and ethical dimensions of teaching and learning, and how we were mediating kids between knowledge systems, okay? So I'm going to skip that. So what we did is we actually paid really careful attention to our instructional practices around launchings. We got to the point that we started crafting, like, what are we definitely going to say in the first 15 minutes of instruction? Kara Jackson has some really beautiful work that shows that in math classrooms, if you start with big ideas, you get better places. We know this in lots of different ways, but I really appreciate the work that demonstrated if you start with lower expectations, you never quite get to the higher mathematics. It's a really similar principle here, right? You're really learning from that work to say your beginnings and the communicated axiological expectations of what this learning environment once mattered throughout. And we realized the kids were grappling with all kinds of storylines. And as instructors, we needed to get better at seeing them in the moment, seeing the complexity of things that kids were trying to navigate so we could engage in productive reframings. So I'm going to show you some of these. This is from Tuesday during our theater group. So what kids have to choose an art group that they're in throughout camp. And they are trying to generate, they write their own scripts. And they try to generate scripts. And Yuna, you might notice that she is still thinking about settlers. I have one more idea. Can we do a before and after? Before we had settlers come and do everything like before, where we're doing the salmon bones and not like leaving and stuff? We sure could, the teacher says. Then we could have a sign that says after and show us grabbing more fish and more fish and more fish and more fish. The teacher says, well, we might have two afters, because we could have the after where people were not very respectful and not very understanding, and then we could have the after today where we're trying to fix some of the time before. And what I want to point out here is that there's a kind of interaction. So first, Una is starting with understanding kind of the political in the thing that she's trying to construct. She's also thinking with stories, which you all wouldn't know, but salmon bones is a linguistic reference to a story, and so is the frame more fish and more fish and more fish and more fish. It comes from an earlier morning story. And so she's trying to weave story in again into the kind of story that they're trying to create for the theater. But the teacher does this thing where she says, okay, that is a true story, but I'm going to expand it and say maybe there's two futures, right? So we start to see teachers actually doing this deliberate, like, yes ands. What are other possibilities? They go on, and another student says, so depending on the choices we made, and another student says, I have a good idea. Una says, we could try to make it seem like two paths, where one of us is standing up to the side, and they're smiling and look evil. The other one looks all good and stuff, and Scrooge has to choose which one they want to do. They ended up writing a play called Scrooge D.T. McDuck, and he had to make a choice about a pipeline. Imagine what they were being influenced by. So Laura and Chris go on to say, so they start thinking about these futures as connected to decisions that are being made. Part of what I want to get here is that opening up multiple possibilities opened the space for kids to think about the kinds of decisions that they were being made and what the consequences of them were in pretty specific ways. So thus far I've said nothing about hummingbirds. On Wednesday, we went to Suquamish to go see where the fish were from the restoration site. And we were there, we were visiting one of the restoration sites, and the man that was showing us there was a non-native person. And as we were going down, the group of little kids found a baby hummingbird that had an injured wing in the middle of the woods. 10 kids around it, oohing and awing, wondering what we should do, thinking about their responsibilities. I went over and I talked to them about sometimes this is what happens. This baby hummingbird will feed somebody else. They didn't like that answer at first. It was a lot of work. And the man walks through the middle of a circle and steps on the baby hummingbird, picks down, kneels down, picks it up, and chucks it over everyone's head into the woods. And everything you all just did, now imagine 7, 8, 9-year-olds and 2 parents that lost their mind. Let's just say people experienced it as deeply violent in that moment. I actually think the man didn't mean to step on it, but then realized what he did. and like didn't know what to do. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the reaching down and picking it up as their response to a mistake, and chucking it was the big mistake. And part of, we should just know that about 40% of these kids are in group homes or in foster homes, and so navigating adults who make mistakes is part of their well-being issues. Anyway, so we had that day. We were not allowed to video record on that day. I am allowed to share that story, but you don't get to see the data of that. But that is what happened. Thankfully, we had an elder there who like lifted us up because it was disaster. Like kids were crying. Like it was chaos for a minute. She ended up bringing us and actually telling us stories about recovery and kind of ways of people making mistakes. And the day ended up all right, but we knew we needed to come back to it. And so I want to just show you a couple things about where we ended up with, and I'm sorry, I'm going to take another 5 minutes, and I hope you all are okay with that. When we opened the framings of the next day, we started with actually having to show kind of the ethical and political relations and being able to narrate what was the problem with Brian's the day before. We talked about, this is a teacher talking about that Brian didn't have the right relationships with hummingbirds, and that was why we were remaking relations and making sure we were in right relations. But it also was narrating how is it that Brian got here. One of the things that we wanted to make sure that didn't happen, to be frank, is that this became a racialized kind of experience for kids. The man who stepped on it was a white man. Many of the kids said, see, that's what white people do. And we were really deliberate about trying to remediate the kinds of ways that people were understanding it and what kids were thinking. And so you can see some of this. I'm not going to say all of it, but the point is that we were really trying to actually think about right relations with land and with more than humans as the thing to focus on, and what should we do. What ended up happening, we went from we should call the police on him to we should make memorials for the hummingbird. And part of why I want to just say that, I'm going to show you what that looked like, is that the kind of we should call the police on him is an actually energetic move that recenters human in the problem. And what was really interesting is a kid ended up saying, I know what we should do. We should make memorials of them like we do for our ancestors. And so I'm going to show you, this is kind of, kids did them all over. They popped up all over our camp. And I'm going to show you an example.
Who made it? Oh, squishy.
I still don't see why he stepped on it and threw it away.
And he's just sorry. Oh well.
So you might wonder how we got this video. Kids had POVs. We had no idea this was happening. We discovered a bajillion of these actually happening between the children and in between times from their POV cameras. The other thing just to note is that one kid had made that memorial and another came over and contributed to it, and there was no like, don't touch it, that's mine. We saw this kind of collective making of memorials to the hummingbird spontaneously everywhere. That's kind of another example of remaking relationships with others. I'm going to show you a little bit further along. During a clay making session.
So we're doing this so we can have a bowl, so that, because we're not going to leave it here, but Jeanette will be holding it, and next year when we get together in a circle and we put in sage, we can use this bowl and we'll always remember the hummingbird.
A long time ago, there was a man, and he was smart in his own sense, but he was careless. And then one day he was showing these people that came up every year in the summertime. And then when he was showing them how he hoped the salmon
You cover it up, we just won't add any more water. So that's good. I might give it like a final as it's drying out. With that, I'll just kind of clean up. You see that all the little, and sometimes the little things make it actually look more realistic. Yeah, but I'll kind of clear, you know, like any little of the little thing, I'll try to sweep it off.
And
Huh?
then
Is
this
it okay?
man
Yeah.
being so
Yeah,
disrespectful,
it
the
is.
hummingbird.
Even
did a fingernail over here.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Awesome.
the humming,
I like
and the
it.
baby
Excellent
hummingbird
work.
was mad at him. So then those people sent him a letter, and then they made graves for that hummingbird, and then they never forgot. Memorials.
The man took it up by its tail and threw it into the woods like it was trash.
What did you learn? You shouldn't step on baby animals.
You shouldn't really step on it. You shouldn't step on animals.
And this story was called
That's perfectly fun.
The Careless Man.
The careless man named Brian.
You can also tell the story about a hummingbird and imagine everything that it lived before up until the point that happened. And the story there is more about all the life that the hummingbird had.
336.
All right, there's lots to say about this, but again, for us, this is story work happening, and kids retelling traditional stories. Even a long time ago this happened, although it just happened yesterday. It's actually a really good sign for Indigenous children. The other thing that I want to point out about this is the instructor at the end lets them tell the whole story and then does this reframing again, right? And the reframing is towards not being dominated by Brian's mistake. And so what I'm trying to do is show you how in these moments the teacher's reframing actually has really significant political and ethical consequences for how the kids are thinking. And what they end up doing, I'm gonna fast. So here is the piece that they end up making. And the instructor ends up gifting this to our camp elder. And one of the things that I think is really important here is that he ends up saying that I think there's important lessons in holding that story about the hummingbird for the next generations of kids that come through here. Part of what we started to see in instructors' languages is the assumption of Indigenous future and kids behaving in ways that they were making things and sharing stories towards Indigenous futures that were ethical and different than only responding to Brian's. Okay? And part of what I'm getting at here is that we were learning about climate change and ocean acidification centrally. I could have given you a talk that showed you their reasoning about that. But part of what I think is really, really important is how is it that we're seeing the political and ethical dimensions of teaching and learning as part of kids' routine sense-making, whether we're daylighting it or not. And for us, part of what has happened over time is recognizing both what we were resourcing and what we were not, because kids were making sense anyway. Okay, and so I kind of want to, because of time, I'm going to end by just saying that for us, over time, I'm skipping a whole bunch of things, thinking about learning environments that can do the complexity of learning about ocean acidification at the same time that we're helping children imagine beyond a collapsed environment or a collapsed world is kind of an ethical responsibility in my mind, or else what we're doing is we're further traumatizing young people about their potential futures. I think we're really unpracticed about this as educators, and we often don't have really good routine ways of doing it. Now, we've done this in launchings, but I want to attend to the fact that educators actually attuned to it can start doing it in these micro ways that don't require tons of things. I've just showed you a series of small moves that teachers realize there's a particular power construct happening here. If I reframe, there's other possibilities that open up. And I think that there's a lot of work to do here. And part of why I'm attending to the micro here is because I don't think it takes a lot of work. I think that we could do a lot without having to think about shifting all of the grounds of our learning environments. Whether or not you're starting with kind of the view of decolonialism and anti-racism, whether or not you're talking about whether you're teaching a Western chemistry class, I think that these axiological positionings show up in our activity all the time, and our attunements to them are fairly muted. So I think I'll end there, and sorry I took so long. Thank you.
We have time for questions, if people have questions now.
This is perhaps more on the surface, but I'm very excited to see all of the education in the camp. And the opportunities to be out and to experience and interact with nature. But then thinking about how to bring that up to scale and have that be happening for many children in many places. How do we handle the actual care of the environment that having large numbers of kids trampling through the land doesn't destroy the land? I'm basing this on some work that was done in the Morton Arboretum area and in DuPage, where the program for actually raising smallmouth bass and doing more interaction in the field ended up being shut down because too much of the land was being used with these kids who were novices in how to handle the situation.
So a few things. I can do this in the alleys of Chicago too. I don't think that we have to construct only natural spaces that are in the middle of being restored. I think that most of these phenomena, not most, they are all happening in urban spaces too.
Okay.
Just to say that.
Yeah, that's
the second piece I'll say about that is that I think that when people have different relationships to the world around them, they move in it differently. So one of the things that we started to see when we first went to the tidal pools, you would see lots of rock throwing, you would see lots of rocks being picked up and crushing little crabs. There were all kinds of ways that people have questions. It's partly why people try to keep children and there aren't big, like, take kids to tidal pool programs. It's because the assumption is that children can't learn how to behave in ways that are ethical in the natural world. And I think that's a learned behavior. And I think what we have seen over time is actually kids teaching each other. As new kids come into camp, they teach each other. We see care showing up. Now, it is still the case that human impacts on place are an issue. I have real questions about whether or not we should be holding the human impacts that change a generational view of the large-scale impacts that we seem to have no movement on as the place to cut. We shouldn't do this. And what I'm getting at is we hand them laptops. We are asking children to be engaged in all kinds of ways in the world that are having really bad degradational impacts, but somehow getting them back on land isn't feasible. I think the politic of that is short-sighted, and I'm not suggesting you, but I've heard this.
No.
Yeah.
I think you've given two good ideas to come back with how we can provide more opportunities.
The other thing that I'll say, and I think there's a movement happening, is how do we transform the space around schools to be living classrooms? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of really interesting urban architecture that is developing in that kind of way. That is also like going towards what are biomaterials that are durable. So I really think there are possibilities. It's more of a failure of imagination that we've thought about, that I think that there are solutions if people wanted to sink in.
So I guess I'm Indian, from India, and so a lot of what you were saying about narratives and songs and folklore and mythologies that hold beliefs, theoretical frameworks, morals, essentially a way of life is how I was brought up by my grandparents, right? But I think in the neoliberal shift that is happening globally, a lot of that has been lost even to me, because at least for the last more than a decade, I've not heard any schooling or narratives that touch back to where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
So because you started off with talking about trying to integrate these indigenous knowledge systems into more, for the lack of a better term, formal education systems, do you have any concrete steps or ideas on how you could take that forward?
Yeah, I have a project in 5 schools at K3. I think it's happening. I think the issue is whether people can even fathom that there are multiple knowledge systems that kids should be learning, right? Part of the reason I start with this ontological claim is because it's very hard for people to imagine that. It's only in the United States that we think it's hard for humans to learn more than one language. Multilingualism is not hard for humans. It's only hard when social and political context create it is hard. it is not hard for humans to learn multiple knowledge systems. It's happened globally across time. It's only hard when we set up particular social and political systems that make it hard. So I think that, like, I appreciate and know that there has been, my hackles go up about the word loss a little bit, as if I forgot it. That's not what you meant, I know. But what I'm trying to get at is that I think that in Indigenous communities here, right, you know, I don't speak my language fluently. My grandfather was the last one to speak. I have my father-in-law is 90 years old and is a fluent Navajo speaker, but didn't teach his children or his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren. I don't believe that someone in our family line won't speak Navajo again. The question is what are the kinds of resurgences that happen, and whether or not we think loss is real. I also think that there's a kind of purity narrative that ends up being imposed on Indigenous knowledge systems and an authenticity narrative that is problematic. Every generation has always remade their stories and knowledges. They've always decided what gets passed on. And there's actually really interesting work looking at some of the diasporas of stories. So trickster narratives actually are all over the globe. And there's some really interesting critical studies work to think about, like, why? Why would humans have continued to need to tell the trickster stories? And what communities, right? So I also think that at least I have elders that would say our stories come when we live in the right ways, and that as we find them, more and more will come or be returned. And what we've learned actually with elders, it's this summer, so you just left. I have to be honest, I didn't think when we did this program in Chicago, storytelling isn't as active as it is in Seattle. We ran this program, and people were spontaneously telling their traditional stories. There was a guy there who I haven't heard him tell a story in 25 years. Told 4 spontaneously. So for me, there's also this thing about the thing you're saying is partly about those conditions. What are the conditions under which particular ways of knowing can emerge, seen as relevant, right, and worthwhile to engage with? And so we can talk about this as Indigenous knowledges, but your question is actually applicable beyond sort of different knowledge systems. It's what becomes resourced in learning environments as relevant and useful to engage in, or necessary to engage with, or rigorous to engage with. All of those things are kind of knowledge dynamics that get set up. You had your hand up.
I did, and it's related to this question. So I want to push a little bit on this knowledge system thing. So ontological shifts are really hard, we know this, right? And your proposition that people can maintain multiple ontologies sounds great, but what I want to know is what is your possible future on how that's achieved, due to the fact that wars are fought over ontological differences, people are murdered over ontological differences, people are declassified as humans for ontological differences between different cultures. How do you see us moving there that doesn't trivialize ontological differences by learning environments that are embedded in one system?
I think that is the question. I think there's a question about whether the histories of human interactions are all violent in ontological encounters. I think it's a Western story, and it's a way to actually make it feel like it's a ridiculously hard thing to do. I think for me, in Indigenous communities in North America, right, we have lots of stories where we also fought with each other, but we also did not, right? Like, urbanity isn't a modernity construction. There have been places of trade between peoples across the globe historically forever. So I don't know the answer to that. Vine would say that's the human maturation question. That is centrally to, like, humans have to decide what kinds of beings we want to be, and that is the question. There's a really remarkable work coming out of the Global South around pluriversalities and what it means to actually manage multiple ontologies. And I don't mean to trivialize ontological denial. It is the basis of violence, for sure. But I also think that, like, the narratives of difference that defines our society as necessarily conflictual is a kind of axiological positioning that not all communities have done, right? And they haven't all been done where power positioning happens. So in my work, I talk a lot about the construction of human supremacy. Actually is one of the original ontological differences that actually enable all these other conditions. Who gets to be more human? Who has the right to hurt life? What life? has to do with original construction of human ontologies, of human supremacy as an ontological grounding. That's my answer to you right now. Other than I can see children continually engaging in more and more ethical behavior when we make space for it. It's partly why I have to hang out with kids, because I'm not sure adults are willing and wanting to create communities that explore the possibility. And just to say, like, for good reason, right? Like, the dehumanization and ontological denial of being is violent. And it is not just theoretical. It is who is killed without repercussion, right? It's whose beings have to go in hiding in order to survive. Like, those are real, so I don't want to trivialize them, but I also don't think that a 5-year-old is born with that, right? It's a learned perception of the world. And that it's more about adults learning what's possible and imagining a different kind of future than what I think we are capable as human beings.
I think we have time for one more question. Then we can move conversations out front, for sure.
Well, I too think that this is an important conversation, this particular exchange. And it's related to what I was going to ask you anyway. When you were talking about plant communication, you know, what we know very clearly how fungal networks work underneath the ground as communication. I mean, I never quite know what to do with that word, but scientists are using the word communication systems, fungal networks as communication systems. Or even thinking of Lynn Margulis's works, a lot of the stuff that's occurring with evolutionary biology, asking questions about what is the self, for instance. We know the sort of work that microbes are doing. They retain their independence. They are a self, so to speak, inside the body. And if we are a multiplicity of selves, then what are we? I mean, there's some very interesting questions. So the issue I guess I wanted to ask you was, there does seem to be an increasing convergence between this kind of scientific work and indigenous beliefs. And I'm kind of wondering where the overlaps are and where the differences are, precisely along these lines. I mean, the ontology question is beginning to dissolve, at least one sense of a kind of what is ontologically real is beginning to dissolve, and it's already being replaced through scientific work itself, and indigenous knowledges have always had a different kind of ontological sense. So it seems to me that there's a kind of like a gravitation in which these two systems of thought are already beginning to merge. And so I was wondering what you thought a future might be in terms of these kinds of considerations.
Yeah. So one, yes, I think that is happening. And I think the kinds of, you know, I mean, whether we're talking about posthumanism, new materialisms, or kind of some of the relational ontological philosophical work coming out of physics, I think all of it is really interesting around constructions of bordering and maybe interactions, right? And I think indigenous knowledge systems have always been there. And I think there are a couple of reasons. I think that actually the linguistic shifts and the dominance of noun-based languages had something to do with how knowledge worked for a while. And I think we're starting to see that even though nominalization forwards thought in particular ways, we're actually seeing something that we see in a lot of verb-based languages across the globe in the way that description works, showing up in thought all over the place. So part of what I think could happen, the other thing is I'm totally geeking out about the second quantum revolution and what people are learning around electrons' infinite potentials, right? And the problems, if we think about the way that measurement and the need to actually have a finite point in things has led to particular things, I think that what we're seeing is actually a self-construction difference, but I also think that the attentional focus, being on interaction rather than definitional, is an interesting new possibility. I also think, quite frankly, I think that nation-state constructions as governance is probably going to have to change. I think that we see things like, ooh, we can make choices for the land of our nation-state. It's good for our political construction, but not the place we live, is fundamentally a flawed logic that is going to have to shift. Now, whether that's just we understand land differently so we make decisions about it, or if we also understand the ways that human communities are configured with places has to shift, that large scale, it's partly what, minds have known this for a long time. If we think about the rise of large scale urban systems pre-modernity, but also their decline, right? That happened in different places in the world. And that in that, we might think about how and why different communities have learned what mattered when. And quite frankly, like, we're still in the era where European nations thought they could conquest everything. And we've birthed governments in which world domination is still a kind of thing. And I think that, like, figuring out, in the same way we can think about ontological denial as a violent thing, I think we also have to think about what global governance means. And I think that, you know, for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about how the construction of the commons is a failed global framework for natural resource development. It hasn't produced climate change policy that has worked. And part of it is the construction of self underneath it. So a lot of that is, like, I'm not sure. I do think we should be looking to the global south for understandings about what has been happening there for a long time. Now, they're increasingly violent, but they're fueled in particular kinds of ways, right? And part of it is that I think that we have a deep dig in to wanting to maintain the current political order. And I think that it's why you don't get much rights of nature taken up in the United States. I think it's why the United States was the very last nation on earth to sign the Declaration of Indigenous Rights, right? There is no, and it's because there wants to be no accountability to both indigenous peoples as well as lands. Because we have models of extraction, and I think we're going to have to move away from models of extraction and the more and more as the primary kind of driver for a lot of things about what new worlds will look like. That isn't to say I think we're going to do really interesting things with built worlds. I do. I think we have to, right? I think my biggest worry, I've done a lot of work in Micronesia and other climate change hotspots where the fish migrate differently, right? The ontological possibility has already shifted. Like, their worlds are different. Most of us have a hard time because some of the other things that need to shift haven't happened because we're in what I've written about as land privileged places. That we have structures that have protected us from the things that are already happening, so we don't have to act, right? We've disincentivized at sort of scale behavior change. And it's partly because, quite frankly, the economic behavioralist models, rational actor models, are failing right now, right? We have tons and tons of educated populace. Yes, we have lots of people who are climate deniers, but we have also tons and tons of other people, like myself, whose carbon footprint is disgusting. I fly all over the place, right? Like, I'm still not quite engaging in behaviors that I know are necessary for everyday life. So I don't know what it all will look like, but I do think that we're seeing people having to figure out how are we going to govern ourselves where we're not insisting on ontological sameness or models of human supremacy and extraction. And I don't think we're there. I think we're a long ways from there now, but we're going to have to get there. And I don't think mega urbanity is going to be a thing.
Did everybody hear Megan's answer to that question just now? Oh my goodness, I wish we had been writing it all down. Can we give Megan a big thank you and move the conversation?